This is a 2009 Ferrari 430 Scuderia, and it's a serious car. These days, Ferraris are made for rich people and rich people who want to seem hardcore. But back when this car was new, it was actually hardcore. The lightweight, track-focused, high-performance version of the regular Ferrari F430 with basically no luxuries. Today, I'm going to review this 430 Scuderia and show you all of its quirks and features. Before I get started, big news, this Ferrari 430 Scuderia is currently for sale, being auctioned live on Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website. This is a very special car finished in this gorgeous red in fantastic shape with no real modifications, and it can be yours on Cars and Bids. So once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to head over to the live auction for this 430 Scuderia, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. Alright, time for the quirks and features of the Ferrari 430 Scuderia. But first, I'm going to start with a little general overview of what this car is. Like I said before, this was the high-performance, lightweight, faster, track-focused version of the regular Ferrari F430. The regular F430 was already an expensive, fast, exciting, exotic car, but this was more expensive, faster, and more exciting, and it was also rarer. The 430 Scuderia was produced for a far shorter period of time in far smaller numbers than the regular 430, so it's far more special. And as you might imagine, the 430 Scuderia had a lot of upgrades over the standard F430. Two huge ones. Number one, this car had more power. A regular 430 was around 480 horsepower. This was around 500, so about 20 more horsepower and about 5 more pound-feet of torque. I think it went from 342 pound-feet in the regular to 347 in this car. And they did that with a revised intake for the engine, a revised exhaust system, and a higher compression ratio in order to get that extra power out of this car. And next up, another big change for the Scuderia compared to the standard 430, this car was a lot lighter. Ferrari said 220 pounds lighter, which is a pretty significant number, and they did that by pulling out weight just about everywhere they possibly could. One example is carbon fiber. That was added in a lot of places throughout the car to save weight. On the outside, you can see it on the mirror caps, which are finished in carbon fiber instead of the standard painted regular mirror caps like you had in the regular 430. Also on the outside, you had the rear glass replaced with Lexan, which is like a lightweight material, more expensive, but lighter in order to help this car lose weight compared to the standard 430. The result was a total carb weight of 3,150 pounds, give or take, for the 430 Scuderia, which is pretty light, especially by modern standards as cars get heavier and heavier. But beyond the extra power and the lighter weight, there were a lot of other changes to the 430 Scuderia compared to the standard F430. Another big one was brakes. The Scuderia came standard with carbon ceramic brakes, and they were bigger than the ones you'd get in the regular F430. 15.7-inch front rotors here compared to 15-inch front rotors in a standard 430. Now, also in this vicinity, another change to the 430 Scuderia, different wheels. It had these wheels, which always seemed more aggressive and more exciting compared to the kind of happier wheels in the regular 430. Another big distinction for the Scuderia compared to the standard model was up front, where the Scuderia has enlarged holes in the front bumper. They're bigger, more aggressive, angrier looking, and of course their extra size allows them to bring in more air. You also have these little vents over on the sides of the front bumper directly in front of the front wheels. The standard F430 didn't have that, but the Scuderia did, which gave it a distinctive look as well. And there's still more. On the outside, another big change for the 430 Scuderia was a stripe. You can see it here. It goes from the hood in front to stripes up onto the roof and then onto the back, just a little bit at the very back of the car. The regular F430 could not be had with a stripe, at least not from the factory from Ferrari, but the 430 Scuderia had that kind of characteristic stripe to help distinguish it. And then we move around back where there are still more upgrades compared to a regular F430. The most obvious is probably the rear diffuser. You can see here it's much larger than what you got in the standard 430. It looked cooler, and presumably it had some aerodynamic benefit it when this car was going fast around a racetrack. You also had a different rear grille back here. You can see largely finished in carbon fiber, which you didn't have in the regular F430. Again, a distinctive look for the Scuderia and probably helps save some weight. And speaking of weight savings around back, you also have this badge back here. You'll notice it doesn't say F430. That was what they called the standard car. The Scuderia was so focused on saving weight that they got rid of the F. Didn't need it. Of course, that's not the actual reason, but they did call this the 430 Scuderia. The regular car was the F430. Never really gave an explanation, but that's what they did. And since I'm around back in the 430 Scuderia, we're near the exhaust, we might as well take a listen to this glorious sound. Now, of course, that sound comes to us courtesy of this engine, which is truly breathtakingly gorgeous. You can look at it through this rear window and see it on the outside of the car, or you can open up the front door, go into the door jamb. There's a latch here, you can see, pull that, and then you open up the rear hatch, which gives you access to the engine compartment, and you can stare up close at this glorious and beautiful powertrain that propels the 430 Scuderia. Truly beautiful, very cool, says Ferrari on both sides, carbon fiber everywhere. It's really fantastic. A couple of especially cool quirks in the engine compartment. For one, I love that in the center of everything you have the Ferrari prancing horse mounted on a Ferrari shield. It looks very cool, just perfect in there. I also love the fact that there's a warning label under here telling you not to touch because it's hot, and it kind of looks like it's giving you the middle finger. Look at that, it kind of looks like it's flipping you off. Don't touch, but also well, I'm flipping you off while I'm telling you. Kind of a funny little Easter egg under the hood. And next up, we move inside the 430 Scuderia, where you'll once again find major changes compared to the standard F430, the most obvious of which is there's no leather. Ferraris are not just beautiful on the outside, but also on the inside. They're filled with gorgeous Italian leather on basically every surface, but not here. In fact, there's no leather at all in this interior. It's all been replaced by carbon fiber, which is lighter, and by Alcantara, which is racier. There's no leather in here, instead all carbon fiber and Alcantara, and mesh. You can see the headliner in the 430 Scuderia is this like mesh type substance, and that's also true of the seats. Instead of leather, you have mesh, black and red, and decidedly not particularly luxurious compared to hand-stitched leather, but that's not the point of this car. It's not intended to be luxurious, it's intended to be sporty. And that's especially true if you look closer at the seats. You'll notice not only are they mesh, but they're also tight sports seats intended to keep you in place when you're going around a track. They have holes in them for a racing harness if you want to hook one up, and they're a lot less comfortable and cuddling than what you'd get in a standard 430. You'll also notice if you look on the seat backs, they're carbon fiber. So the seats too are intended to help save weight by going carbon fiber and mesh instead of large overstuffed leather like in the regular model. Now, for further proof that this is the high-performance, track-focused version of this car, take a look at the floors. You can see floor mats, but if you lift those up, you just have bare flooring in this car. There's no carpeting like you would have in just about everything else. That's been removed to save weight. You don't need it in a race car. Instead, you just have these bare aluminum metal floors, and it's pretty basic. And in fact, if you look around this interior, you can actually see welds, open spots where there are just exposed welds. You would never have that in any other car. It would be covered by carpeting or just about anything else, but here they figure race car, who cares if you can see the welds? And so you can, very stripped down. And this focused race car persona is also visible on the door panel, which you can see here. It's just a big slab of carbon fiber, and there's also a net for storage. You don't get like beautiful leather, hand-stitched, a nice armrest, none of that stuff, just the carbon fiber and the net. Also distinctive to the 430 Scuderia, instead of a glove box, you get another net. Right here, this is your interior storage, a couple of nets, rather than a glove box or storage compartments you don't need that in a track-focused supercar. And another great example of this car's track focus is, well, it has a fire extinguisher in the passenger footwell. This wasn't added by the owner. It was put in from the factory in a lot of these 430 Scuderia models, because if you're on the racetrack, a fire might break out and you want a handy fire extinguisher, so there it is. Now, another upgrade to this car came to its transmission. The 430 Scuderia still uses a sequential manual transmission with a single clutch rather than a dual clutch like later Ferrari models and most modern sports cars and supercars. So it was still a sequential manual. Ferrari called it the F1 transmission, but in the 430 Scuderia, it was intended to be especially quick. Ferrari said a regular F430 shifted at 150 milliseconds. This was down to 60 milliseconds, so it was much, much faster. And indeed, this was the fastest version of Ferrari's F1 transmission. So fast that they called it super fast. 2, not just super fast, 1. Now, the transmission shifting, the extra power, the lighter weight, all of these changes combined to make this car quicker, of course. The regular 430 quoted 0 to 60 time was around 4 seconds. This was 3.6, so it shaved off about 0.4 of a second from 0 to 60, which is quite a bit. Now, it's worth pointing out that this car, as lightweight and raw and track-focused as it wasn't completely, totally hardcore. For example, it did have air conditioning, which you can see here, climate controls. You can turn on air conditioning for some level of comfort. It also had an infotainment system with navigation. This tiny little screen would apparently give navigation directions if you had it set up, which seems absolutely ridiculous, but that's what it offered. It allowed Ferrari to say it had navigation, even though it was kind of a crappy system, clearly. Although that frankly fits with Ferrari at this time. They didn't care that much about the little luxuries and the little niceties and the attention to detail in these cars. One good example of that is the little pixelated display in the gauge cluster that shows when the rear compartment is open. Look at this terrible image of this car. This was a time when LCD screens were becoming pretty popular. Ferrari was still going with this ridiculous pixelated display. And another good example of Ferrari not really focusing on the details is what happens when you put on the turn signal. A light turns on in your gauge cluster, but it's generic. It doesn't show which turn signal is on, left or right, just shows you that a turn signal is on. Now, this was common in cars in the 60s and 70s. The light wouldn't tell you which turn signal is on, but the 430's got to be the last car to ever have a light like that. Ferrari did it all the way through 2010, not telling you which signal was on. And how about this lack of attention to detail? The little switch to turn on the dome light when the doors are open, the icon for it has a car with 4 doors open, even though this car only has 2 doors. They probably just borrowed the icon from some other vehicle with 4 doors. Again, not great attention to detail. But anyway, other quirks and features in this interior. For one thing, this little switch on the steering wheel adjusts your drive mode. And in the 430 Scuderia, there was no snow mode. I mention that because the regular F430 did have a snow mode, but they took it out for this car. They figured no one was ever going to drive it in the snow. Instead, they added one extra mode that allowed you to control the level of traction control. Now, also cool on the steering wheel, you have this little panel at the top. That was a series of lights that would light up when you were near red line, letting you know that it was time to shift or that you were getting close to time to shift. They would light up and then you would shift the paddle and you felt cool and awesome. And that really was a neat feature. Now, also in this vicinity, you have your gauge cluster, which has in the very center a giant tachometer. The standard 430 also had a tachometer in the center, but in the Scuderia, the numbers were all in italics, I think to signify more urgency. It was a faster car, and so it got italicized numbers on its tachometer. And another interesting quirk in this interior is a little plaque over on the passenger side letting you know that Ferrari won the Formula One Constructors' Championship in 2008. The year before this car was made, they wanted to brag, so they stuck that plaque in a lot of their models at this time. And finally, we move into the cargo area of the 430 Scuderia, which in this car, of course, is up front, and it's actually surprisingly large. You can see it's pretty decent sized for any exotic car, let alone the track-focused version of an exotic car. You get decent space in here where you can store stuff for a nice trip. Now, aside from that, there's nothing especially unusual or exciting or interesting up here, except for this little leather pouch over to the side. This is the toolkit, which Ferrari has included in a lot of its vehicles for a long time, and it's included here as well. Now you open it up and you discover it is a 430 Scuderia specific toolkit. It has Scuderia branding, which is kind of neat, and it has only a couple of tools. You can't actually do very much with this, but you buying a car at this price point, you probably weren't going to anyway. One other funny thing about this toolkit, it has Ferrari branded gloves. As you can see, gloves with the Ferrari prancing horse, so if you're changing a tire, you won't get your hands dirty thanks to your Ferrari gloves. Now, one other thing I want to mention about the 430 Scuderia is, in addition to the coupe, they also made a convertible version. They called it the 430 Scuderia 16M, and its production was far more limited than the coupe. Ferrari claims they made only 499 16M models, probably a little bit more than that in reality, but still far more limited production and rarer. Now, that was a change compared to the 360, the predecessor to the 430, which also offered a high-performance version called the Challenge Stradale, but that was only available as a coupe. In the 430, they expanded it to a convertible, and then it became the 458 Speciale and the Speciale Aperta, and it's a tradition that continues today. All right, driving the 430 Scuderia. I gotta tell you, I reviewed one of these about 5 years ago now, I think. But I loved it so much that I saw this one come into our queue at Cars and Bids, and I thought, I'm gonna go do an updated review. I really want to get behind the wheel of this car again. I think it's amazing, and I can give a more in-depth review in my newest format. So let's talk about the way this car drives. So I want to be clear, I really love the 430 Scuderia. A lot of car enthusiasts will tell you that the 458 Speciale was the last true performance Ferrari, but I like this car more. The 458 was an amazing car. It was faster, it was rarer, I think. But the thing about this car that was so cool is it still had this kind of raw, old school Ferrari feel. The 458 didn't. The 430 simply feels more mechanical. I make fun of it for that little pixelated display in the gauge cluster and for the turn signal light thing and all this stuff, but like, that was part of the charm, and Ferraris have gotten pretty sanitized. Now, I wouldn't call a 458 Speciale sanitized, but it is kind of an easier car. This is definitely more like mechanical, more raw, and you feel more, and I love that about this car. And I think that for that reason, I think this is one of the coolest modern Ferraris. Oh, and the sound is, oh, it sounds so good. Drives so well, sounds so good. Oh, and it's so tight around corners. Another amazing thing about this car, people overuse the go-kart metaphor. Most cars don't feel like a go-kart. This one almost does, in part because the ride is so rough. Like you're getting beaten up by this car. That's a reality of it. It has incredibly stiff suspension, but the benefit is you have also an unbelievable direction changing ability, and you're so low, you just feel like you're the king of the world. You really feel like you're in a race car or a go-kart. It really does feel like that. And I'll tell you, having driven a lot of regular F430s, they don't have that feeling. They're still amazing cars. They're tremendously fun to drive. They're very exciting, but this car just has this raw, like, energy to it that I think is amazing. And it has this mechanical feel that I think even the 458 Speciale doesn't have. I have always felt that this car was a little undervalued because the 360 Challenge Stradale, which came before this, which is also an amazing car, seems like the market appreciates that car more. I think it's a little bit rarer. It was kind of the first of these. And then the 458 Speciale is sort of the end of the line for the naturally aspirated engine. So people really focus on those. But I think that this car is probably the best of all of them to actually drive. Now, of course, the great irony in this is people paying this kind of money for these cars don't often drive them. But if you're going to, this is the one. It's focused, it's fast, it's so exciting. I love this car. Now, with that said, I want to be upfront about the drawbacks about this car because they do exist. This car's not perfect. The biggest is unquestionably it's stiff, it's rough, it's loud, it rattles at stoplights, like the mirrors rattle. Like, this is not a luxurious daily driver. If you think of a Ferrari as like a leather-wrapped car that you can just kind of cruise in, like a lot of the newer ones are, this ain't that. This is a focused car, and it'll kind of beat you up. It's rough on the road, it's loud, it doesn't have a lot of creature comforts, and that's the truth. The other thing about this car that really should be known, the transmission. I have kind of come to like the F1 style transmission more and more over the years because it feels mechanical, and if I can't have a manual, I kind of like that mechanical feel of an F1, even though I know it's slower than a dual clutch. but it's not as fast as a dual clutch. That's the drawback. Now, it's the fastest F1 they ever made. It's pretty quick shifting, but it's still nowhere near on the level of an instantaneous shift in a dual clutch automatic, and so that's another drawback. Aside from those things, I don't think this car has any flaws. If you go into this knowing what you're getting, which is a rough, hardcore car, this is one of the coolest rough hardcore cars you can find. And frankly, I think it's a bargain compared to 458 Speciale and a lot of other stuff out there. This kind of flies under the radar. It looks more like a standard 430. It doesn't have all these things like, look at me, I'm different, like a GT3 RS with its huge wing. But man, this car is fun. And that, I think, is what it's all about. I love this thing. And so that's the Ferrari 430 Scuderia. This is a tremendously exciting car that's a lot of fun to drive, but it's also a seriously focused vehicle that's not intended to be luxurious or coddle you. It's for going fast with a purpose, and I love it. And now it's time to give the 430 Scuderia a Doug score. And the Doug score is here, 65 out of 100, which places the 430 Scuderia here against rivals, pretty much right where you'd probably expect. This is a truly special car, and I love driving it. It's fun, it's fast, it looks great, it makes the right sounds, and it's far more rare and interesting than a standard F430. I still think the 430 Scuderia is undervalued, and it's a blast to drive, as long as you're looking for a focused sports car, and definitely not a luxury car.